Wonderful. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Alex Worth, co-founder and CEO of Quorum, and I'm really excited to have two incredible individuals with Holland & Knight join me today. Rich Gold leads their public policy and regulation practice, and Joel Roberson is one of the partners in the public policy and regulation practice. They have been actively lobbying amidst COVID-19, and really excited to have them both on today to talk about lobbying from home and how to adjust your congressional outreach strategy during social distancing. So today, what our agenda is, we're going to hear from them a little bit about their experience so far with lobbying during the coronavirus. We'll talk about strategies for communicating with Congress and what they have found to be most effective. We'll then transition to talk a little bit about communicating and working with regulators and the White House. And then finally, we'll wrap it up by talking about some strategies for thinking about the next piece of COVID legislation, as well as a question about what to do if you're not lobbying related to COVID legislation. As always, we'll end our webinar with some Q&A. So at any point during the presentation, if you've got questions and answers, just drag your mouse down to the bottom of the screen. You'll see a little Q&A tab in Zoom. You can feel free to put your question in at any time, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible at the very end. But before we dive in, just a very quick question for you, and we'll go ahead and launch this poll, is how has your team's engagement with your C-suite or organization leadership shifted during the coronavirus? Are you seeing more engagement from the C-suite and that they're much more involved in the work of the public affairs team than before? Is it about the same, or have you seen it decrease as they have other concerns that are taking their attention away from public affairs? So we'll give it just a couple of seconds here as we see the results come in. So we have 80 of you who have taken this survey so far. Results are still coming in as we go, but looking to be close to a tie. Between 43% of you have seen more engagement from the C-suite, and about 44% have seen about the same. Only 11 of you, 13%, have seen less engagement from the C-suite as concerns are taking their attention away from public affairs. So given that, makes the topic of conversation today even more relevant as all of you are facing the challenges of how do you lobby and really show the work of your team in these times. And I could not be more excited to have both Rich and Joel here to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that they've been using as one of the top lobbying firms in Washington. So maybe as we just off the top, Rich, will you tell us just a little bit about Holland & Knight and your team so that people get a sense of the perspective that you're bringing to this conversation?
Sure, and greetings from the Holland & Knight Wolfboro, New Hampshire office, where I have evacuated DC to rural America to bring the infection outward, as it were. Holland & Knight is a national and international law firm with about 1,400 lawyers around the world. And we focus in our public policy group, about 85 of us, on local, state, and federal government affairs, regulatory work, and strategic and crisis communications. We work a lot for Fortune 500 clients as well as medium-sized businesses, and then we do a lot of city and county work for the large metropolitan counties and the major cities around the country. And really everything, an old-time policy shop in DC, really everything from admiralty to zoning. We're very team-oriented, and that's really shown over the last 3 or 4 weeks, dealing with all the issues coming up from clients regarding the legislation, implementation of the loan programs, all those sorts of things on which Joel's been front and center. So that's why he's here with me today.
That's great. And I think the folks on the webinar see part of the reason why I wanted to have the folks at Holland & Knight is that with 85 professionals all focused on lobbying, it's an incredible vantage point. So maybe the high level question, would love to hear from both of you about some of the challenges that you've seen your team in the lobbying industry in general face while practicing social distancing and working remotely.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing public policy in DC for 35 years now, and I don't think I've seen anything like the 10 days around the CARES Act at any time, whether it was after 9/11 or sort of in the wake of the beginning of the Great Recession in October 2008. Just the absolute invasion, sort of in a very short time period, that shuts down our economy and leads basically Congress to appropriate 8 or 10% of our GDP in a single piece of legislation. So just the circumstances were so unique and so different from the way we act on a daily basis. And then you add on to that the fact that things were such that we couldn't speak to staff and members in person. So you're not only dealing with a crisis like one we've never dealt with before, but you're dealing with it remotely, not only with your team and trying to hold your team together from an advocacy perspective, but also with folks on the Hill, folks in the administration, and our CEOs and clients. So it really was sort of an absolutely unique situation. And as I mentioned, Joel was sort of front and center on that with the hotel industry and a couple other sectors. So I'll let him give his thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rich and Alex. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen is on that team-based approach to lobbying, where you need to get in a high-pressure environment with legislation that's moving very quickly, where you need to get to House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, and the administration at the same time is trying to make that well-oiled machine that works well when you are, your offices are 10 feet away from each other, and you can just pop over and pull together a quick strategy session. Trying to do that when you're remote, where, for people like me, I have 3 small kids that are downstairs doing, we'll use air quotes, homeschooling. And the rest of your team is kind of in the same boat where, I am inviting you right now into my bedroom, which normally I don't do on the first time I meet somebody, but for you guys, I made that exception. But that's because it's the only place that's moderately quiet in my house, and trying to figure out how to deal with that situation that everyone's going through personally, in addition to one of the most high pressure pieces of legislation that we've seen, at least in some time, where you've got clients, or your business, if you're working in-house, is at the brink, where the bottom just fell out of your industry, your revenue or occupancy rates if you're a hotel, or the number of tables that you've got full if you're in a restaurant just went from 80-90% down to 0 overnight. And so your clients or your business, all of a sudden Congress is the solution, and getting the language right is of utmost importance. So trying to do all of that while everything is going on around you, both in your family, in your community, in your hospital, your local hospital, at the same time as you've got all this pressure to get it right up on the Hill, has certainly created the biggest challenges in my perspective.
That's really helpful. So let's talk a little bit about communicating with Congress here. And in particular, as Rich mentioned earlier, the public is no longer allowed to be on Capitol Hill. What mediums of communication have you found most effective for engaging members of Congress specifically? And then also the second part of that question, what have you found for engaging staff?
So there's a dynamic that occurred during the pendency of the legislation that I think was sort of unique, and is not sort of how life will be in this new environment we're in. But really, I was very proud of the Washington lobbying community writ large in that moment, because we were all ancillary staff at that point. And it felt more than it does in everyday life, that you were really advocating for the public good and trying to help members of Congress understand, this program needs to be tweaked this way, otherwise you're not going to help the people you're trying to help. And so staff and members were very open to that feedback. They really I think, were very concerned that they would be in a bubble and not be able to get relief to the people they were trying to get relief to, because they would tweak a program the wrong way or not tweak it enough. And obviously policy making is always a matter of compromise, and you can't address 100% of a circumstance in any particular bill. But I think all of the input and all of the discussions that were had really did help make the legislation much more practical. And there are going to be problems in how it rolls out. It's a huge relief program, but they made a lot of changes along the way to try to address those things up front. And so a lot of our communications in the moment were CEO to senator conversations. Of course, with the CARES Act, you were in a situation where, basically the Senate had control of that bill, and Speaker Pelosi was feeding in ideas through Senator Schumer and through press releases and those sorts of things. So, depending on what we were doing, CEOs were talking to everybody like they always do. They were talking to, McConnell and his lieutenants. They were talking to Schumer. They were talking to Pelosi and House leadership, and making sure that they were getting their views across in terms of what was needed, how much was needed, and where the bar should be on people getting into these loan programs and that sort of thing. So a lot of it was principal to principal conversation, certainly more than would normally be the case on a piece of legislation. And then a lot of it was texting, emails with draft language and phone calls, not only to the Hill and to Hill staff. And this turned out to be the one time, right, where if you didn't have somebody's cell phone, a key legislative director or legislative assistant on the Senate side, you were screwed, because not all the office phones were forwarded to cell phone. So there was a lot of chasing around, trying to find somebody's cell phone, not finding somebody's cell phone, emailing them and saying, hey, can I give you a quick call on this provision? Sort of all those types of logistics that are really different from what you do on a daily basis as a lobbyist. Because you can always just hang outside somebody's office and wait for them to go get a cup of coffee, and now you couldn't do that. But I think, not just the Hill, with Treasury as well. The Treasury guys did a great job here, trying to really sort through the mechanics of how the programs would work and make sure that, again, like the Hill folks, they were taking care of the folks they were trying to take care of. And so it was very interactive with those guys as well. Joel, I don't know if you have additional thoughts.
Yeah, I'd reiterate that principal to principal conversation was most important because it was moving so quickly. I'd also say this particular pandemic has highlighted the importance of personal relationships. So if you in-house or your external lobbyists had personal relationships, you were able to cut through a lot of the noise that, staff working remotely, who no longer had meetings kind of scheduled on the books, who were just getting bombarded by incoming notes or text messages, were having to focus on the ones that they could get to the quickest. And if they saw a name of somebody they knew and trusted, those phone calls and emails were getting returned first. So I think that also just highlighted the importance. We definitely have seen beyond the principal to principal that there has been very effective mediums with doing things like this, doing Zoom or other video mediums allows you to get some of that personal to personal interaction with the ability to see some reaction in delivering your message. But it has been very much principal to principal and relationship based.
I think the principal to principal piece, as well as the texting, are some of the two most interesting takeaways that I had there. But Joel, as you mentioned, a lot of the world here is shifting to a new video world as we're doing this video webinar here today. Have you all been doing video meetings with members of Congress, with their staff? If so, what's been working? What's been a challenge? Tell us a little bit more about your experience with video.
I could take a first crack at that. I'd say that becoming more tech savvy when it comes to video conferencing has been really critical. Things like this, being able to share your screen and be able to interact. I think when you do a Hill meeting, you of course are going to bring leave behind materials. You're going to slide a graphic across the table to emphasize your point. And that's something staff have been very willing to do, is get on a video conference. But being able to use this forum in the same way you would have done a meeting, so that they can not just, okay, I had that video conference and then 30 minutes later I got an email and I got to connect the documents attached to the email with the conversation I had earlier, and maybe I never end up making that connection. Being able to share screens and show them while you tell them has been really important. And the other piece I would say is that sometimes staff are in the same situation you're in. They may be at the playground with their kids who are out of school, and they're taking a call sitting on the park bench, and there's going to be some wind in the background and kids, in the background, but they're still there doing what they can to hear from constituents. You just have to be flexible, both in terms of the digital medium, as well as in terms of your understanding for the personal and health situation that those staff might be going through as well.
It's funny, Alex, just to follow up on that. I think I've done way more video conferencing with our clients and sort of private sector folks than I have with folks in the government. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. One, most of the agencies are not using Zoom. They probably do have, Skype for Business or something else. But for the most part, I think Zoom is ubiquitous in the private sector, and I think it's less the case in government. And just like we haven't been FaceTiming on our cell phones with staff when we talk to them on their cell phone, I think the convention is just more, and the culture is just more, hey, quick call, we'll just go through this on audio, et cetera, et cetera. And when you're talking to congressional staff, we don't tend to set up a call for 2 p.m. and we'll all dial into Zoom and all that. We're going to be on the phone for an hour. It tends to be a lobbying discussion. They have 7 minutes to talk to you. Send me what you want me to look at. Let's talk through it, and then we're going to be done. And so I haven't at least done a lot of video with Hill staff or administration staff. And I actually just had that come up with somebody in the administration who said, yeah, we can't use Zoom for security reasons. So for whatever it's worth. So that's interesting, but it's been very interesting to have a lot of client calls that way. And the other thing we've done over the last 2 weeks, really, and Joel's been participating in most of these, is we've probably done about 15 client webinars with 1 or 2 of them upwards of 5,000 people on them, on CARES, what it means, the loan programs, the state funding, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been fascinating to do with that kind of big community out there, learning about what the bill is, what it does. That's an interaction you could not have done technologically 18 months ago.
Wow. Very cool to hear. And certainly one of the elements that we've heard throughout our webinar series is just the amount of people now doing webinars as they work to broadcast what's happening in Washington out to their own audiences and constituencies. I'm curious, as we look at congressional offices themselves, have you seen any changes in processes or workflow with the staff working remote? And can you share a little bit with us about what that's looked like?
Yeah, I mean, they are struggling, through the situation. So I think workflow is definitely slower, definitely for non-COVID related items than was the case before. I think getting the boss's attention, getting approval for whatever, co-sponsorship, sending a letter, whatever it would be, is clearly and rightfully in the back seat right now. Obviously the normal internal operations are just different when you're remote. That said, I think legislative staff have been very available and there to talk. And frankly, I think they're very happy to have a discussion that is not COVID related, to go back to, a policy issue on, seafood imports or whatever, and kind of talk through it and be helpful as much as possible. But the reality of the situation is their bosses right now are back in their districts. They're experiencing this on a daily basis. They are figuring out what needs to happen, on whatever we're going to do next on CARES Act 2. And that's where a lot of the focus is right now.
The only piece I would add to that is that it has become even more important to be very clear as to what you're asking for. It's very hard for congressional staff to just send them, hey, here's 3 talking points on what we're trying to accomplish in the CARES Act. You need to send them, here's a sentence that you need to add to section 1106, the loan forgiveness of the SBA PPP program, so that they can't walk down the hall to Ledge Council and say, hey, can we walk through this and can I explain to you what I'm trying to accomplish, and you come back with text and I'll go back with text. They need you to present to them what exactly you need them to do, and that shows a lot of the value that you as an outside lobbyist can do is to arm them to make it more easier for them to just evaluate it. Hey, I think this this and needs to be an or whatever, but then they can just keep pushing it along, working from their home office as well.
I think that's really helpful about the importance of being even more direct in these times when you can't go and have a quick conversation in the hallway. One of the things that I think we saw with the CARES Act was that negotiations continued through the weekend. Did your engagement strategies at all change on weekends when obviously the staff might be a little lighter or Congress is still at work, or did it just feel like a continuation of the workday? And what advice would you have to organizations who are needing to engage on weekends while everyone's working from home?
Yeah, I could jump in. I mean, I think it's changed a lot of things. I think it's changed. I find myself offering to clients to do a 7 a.m. conference call when normally, wouldn't be into the office, and asking for offering a conference call at 8 or 8:30, and conference calls on the weekend. It all kind of blends together a little bit more. For those people that were part of the team that was working all weekend, I don't think the engagement really changed that much because they were working in the same environment. A lot of it was elevated to that higher level of committee staff and leadership staff that were negotiating the bill. But for those that were negotiating the bill, I think just like those of us on the outside, they were putting in however much work needed to happen for this bill to come out. They understood how important it was for the country, just like we understand how it's important for the country, and that the interests of our clients that were all being impacted by COVID-19 were being heard. So the work, unfortunately, you continued in a 7-day work week.
Mm-hmm. Would love to spend a little bit of time talking about messaging. Obviously, a number of brands in the consumer world have been really careful about striking the right tone when it comes to talking about COVID. What have you seen in terms of messaging that's worked? As your clients, companies, associations, nonprofits have presented their concerns and their message to Congress?
Oh, Rich, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Joel.
I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is to make sure that you are where you have your asks, that you're asking them appropriately. I've heard of clients or companies that have said, hey, you know what, we have this economic development project and you have to jam it into the CARES Act because we need that influx of capital right now, and not realizing that the CARES Act was really about how do we save lives, how do we save businesses, how do we keep businesses afloat, making sure that your messaging is focused on the right vehicle, the right legislative vehicle, and that you as an outside or internal advocate, public policy expert are advising your client or your business on where they should be focused, where their efforts should be focused. And sometimes that means, let's take a pass on the CARES Act and let's be looking at COVID-4, COVID-5, because laying the groundwork there, you're only going to hurt your brand and your image if you're pushing for something that isn't on the table in the CARES Act, what was COVID-3 response. So I think that's important. And I think just getting a little even more tactical when you do get on the phone with staff, when you do get on the phone with a member of Congress or the Senate, starting off just asking, how are you doing? Like, how is your personal situation in these trying times? Understanding that they are going through situations much like yours, and maybe much worse than yours. They may have a loved one that lost a job. They may have someone in their family that just passed away. And just spending those first 2 minutes talking about that, I think will do dividends to building your relationship, which will extend beyond this crisis. But also making sure that they understand that you're not just viewing them as a tool to get to their end, but but rather understanding that they're going through this very human emotional response process as well.
The only thing I would add is it's somewhat unusual, if not unprecedented, to be in a situation where the first time you're talking to a staffer, you're doing so by phone, and you're making these terribly extraordinary asks for, you know, a constituent or, you know, somebody, an interested party who needs relief. And so the types of discussions we're having have gone from, on the client side, you know, conversations with the C-suite where you have chief executives talking about how difficult it may be 2 weeks from now to make payroll, or 3 weeks from now, to discussions with staff who you may never have seen before and you don't know well, where you're trying to work through how to make the SBA loan program more functional for a broader group of people by telephone. And that's very difficult. A lot of times when we're working on legislation and we're trying to make changes to it and trying to figure stuff out, we have time, and we have time to deliberate. We have time to go have a meeting and sit across the table from somebody and make a joke. And the thing that makes a difference in all that is it's really hard to be, you have to be a good human being and a good lobbyist to, as Joel said, kind of read the signals you're getting from, you know, through the telephone, and remember that the person on the other side of the phone is going through all the same stuff you're going through, working from home, et cetera, et cetera. And it can really be a challenge to be able to figure out what is the essence of our job at any given moment. What do I know about this person, and how can I influence them to accept what I'm saying and convey it to their boss? And doing that in these circumstances, you know, that's never an easy thing to do. That's why what we do is valuable. But doing that in these circumstances has been particularly challenging. And, you know, I think the lobbying community writ large has done a really good job in a public service, helping to shape these relief packages.
So I think really helpful perspective, and especially not only challenging times, but also challenging means of communication that start to throw a lot of the traditional up on end as it comes to Congress. I would love to spend a little bit of time here talking about a little bit farther down the street, working with regulators in the White House. So obviously the White House has been heavily involved in coronavirus related legislation. Curious what practices you have found most effective for engaging with the White House, and any recommendations that you would share with the audience as they think about needing to engage the folks over at 1600 Penn.
Well, I would just say, I think, and Joel mentioned this already, I think the, you know, I think really kind of the lead for the administration legislatively has been Secretary Mnuchin and the Treasury Department. Even on implementation, that seems to be the case as we wait for the Title IV funding to come out this week. But, you know, Treasury has had a lot of involvement, input, and determination around even the SBA loan fund and some of the other things going on. So, you know, I think the key thing has been relationships, as Joel mentioned. This is one of those times where, for you to really be effective, you have to get an email back, right? Or a text message back saying, call me in 10 minutes. Because a lot of what we did in the legislative front over that period of 10 days or so really was done at off hours. You know, a lot of the administration staff were in Hill meetings for a good chunk of the day, and you'd try to catch people kind of in between their conference calls or whatever. And so really relationships were a premium there, and then problem solving also a premium, and being able to come up with solutions, not just problems, because these guys just didn't have time to think through all the possible ways to solve different issues that we were dealing with. Again, going back to the SBA loan program, How do you deal with franchisees that have over 500 employees at a variety of different franchises? They should really be a small business. They should be helped by this fund. You don't want them going to the Treasury Title IV fund, but the rules are the rules with the current SBA program, so we had to recreate those rules. I think dealing with the administration staff, Treasury in particular, and the White House National Economic Council working with Treasury, I think those folks did a great job and really kind of left it all out on the field in terms of trying to make the bill come together. And I sort of viewed their role at the end of the day as really being the advocates for the deal. And I think Secretary Mnuchin did a good job bridging the gap between where Nancy Pelosi was and Leader McConnell was. There were things that Senate Republicans didn't want to say yes to that they probably said yes to at the end of the day to get a deal because Mnuchin urged them to.
Yeah. And I do just one quick thing to add is that relationships are key. Most of the political leadership were Hill staffers at one point, so there's probably people that know them. And then the last thing I'd say is that know who is the decision maker on your issue within the administration. So if your issue is being negotiated by the Treasury Department, going to NEC, could be helpful, but it's going to take too long for you to influence the process. Find out who in the Treasury Department's negotiating your point and get to that person. So that's been something that's been helpful because there have been issues that are delegated to USDA for food, to energy on energy production, to Treasury, to FDA, to CDC, to find out who's the decision maker and get to that particular person, because that'll get you your result the fastest.
I think really helpful piece of advice. Let's talk a little bit about engaging regulators now that the CARES Act has passed, in addition to some of the earlier phase 1, phase 2. How have you seen your ability to engage with regulators and shape what the implementation of the CARES Act looks like, and any recommendations that you would share as people are looking to have an influence on some of what's happened?
Well, one of the things that's been just fascinating to watch is it's almost like you go to a football game and it ends up being Australian rules football. Like we have been dealing with issues that in my career I never thought I would deal with, like essential business determinations and the Defense Production Act. Like, when's the last time anybody dealt with the Defense Production Act? Let's just throw that one out there, right? Who knows what BARDA is, the Biological Advanced Research and Development Agency? Like, who's been dealing with that in their normal day-to-day lives? Who knew there was a national stockpile for all this stuff? Like, when did that happen? I think it's great. Couldn't we have maybe, stockpiled enough stuff given that we had the national stockpile? So just dealing with the issues themselves are like, oh, come on, that's not real. Like this country doesn't do that. There was 10 days where every other day there was a rumor of a national quarantine. Like I spent 2 hours every day knocking down the rumor of the national quarantine. So a lot of it was dealing with agency staff, not just on implementation of the bill, but on these issues that were front and center for them that had nothing to do with legislation, that were about, the FDA trying to ease products getting to market so people would have enough disinfectants, and the Defense Production Act, and making sure we were going to have enough ventilators and all those types of things. Those are things you just don't, in our normal daily lobbying assignments, get handed like, go help on this. And it was really fascinating. So you would be coming at the agency staff from the perspective of, okay, we've got this group of clients interested in the SBA loan program. Here's their concern. We just want to make sure the language is clear. And those guys at Treasury would be like thinking through all that, but also thinking through all this other stuff going on in the background that came with not just implementing the law, but, trying to advance the interests of the country right now. And it was just a fascinating mix of issues.
Indeed. I've got two more questions here for Rich and Joel, and then we want to open it up to the audience. So again, as a reminder, if you pull your mouse down and click Q&A at the bottom, you can submit your question for them. But as we wrap up here, wanted to talk about what lessons from the first three pieces of the COVID legislation did you learn, and what recommendations would you have for engaging on an expected either fourth or fifth bill to come?
You want to start, Joel?
Sure, yeah. So each bill, there was a question answer that's already been submitted on this point, that each bill has had a little bit of a different leadership structure, with the House leading on the first bill, or the Senate leading on the first bill, the House leading on the second bill, the Senate leading on the third bill. So understanding who's leading, just like as is important in the administration, it's important in the Congress as well. A lot of this has been negotiations in the four corners with Pelosi, McCarthy, Schumer, McConnell, with the Secretary Mnuchin primarily. That's expected to continue because Mnuchin has carved out a bit of a negotiator role here, even if he's negotiating on points that go outside of the Treasury Department's purview. So we're expecting that dynamic to continue. But what you need to consider is when you're engaging on COVID-4, COVID-5, is how do you get the most effective messenger to be delivering the message to one of those 5 pressure points, and trying to leverage that delivery system so that you are getting the CEO that matters, the nonprofit, the hospital leader, fundraising contributor to that member of Congress who's going to get their attention and say, hey, listen, this has got to happen in this bill, and here's why. Here's the pain and suffering that's happening. Here's the loss of jobs. Here's the loss of lives. Will you take this to Pelosi? Will you take this to McConnell? Will you take this to McCarthy or to Schumer? And trying to make sure that you're doing that. You're not spending a ton of time on members that are really going to sit by and vote party line. At the end of the day, you're going to those members that have a vested interest in the district, and have the ability to influence at the leadership level so that you can be spending your time wisely.
Yeah, I would say information is key. So in the last 36 hours or 72 hours, we've gone from, starting Friday, Pelosi doing the about face on big infrastructure bill, down to just CARES Act 2. And, a few hours later, it seems we're dealing with just, replenishing the SBA loan fund. And then Democrats coming back and saying, here's the price for what we want. And part of that is just the nature of crisis legislating, but it's rare that we have legislated this way before. The pace of change of the debate is such that by the time we get off this webinar, it will have changed significantly since 3 o'clock, and we'll have to go refresh ourselves. So having good intel, having good information is almost a never-ending job, which is why we've been all working 12, 14, 16-hour days. So that's thing one. Thing two is understanding who your decision maker is, as sort of Joel was just referencing. And you have to be talking to all 4 corners, but who your best advocate is amongst those, and who's going to carry your message and really make it a top priority. Because the horse trading going on here obviously is huge and ongoing. And so you've got to be able to make your case and know who your best champion is going to be for what you're pursuing. And sometimes that's not always clear, right? Like, for instance, in the CARES Act, it was clear we were going to provide relief to state and local level funding. And yet at the same point, the House sort of at the last minute, pursuant to, sort of Democrats wanting to go in this direction, put in a limit that only cities above populations of 500,000 would get direct funding. Well, that carves out a whole bunch of cities, interestingly, particularly those in red states. So you have these blue cities in red states who now have to go to the governor and ask for money, or go to their county and ask for money. And so, you know, who would have thought the House Democrats would have been hurting, you know, cities in Georgia and Florida who are blue cities that vote for Democrats. So you have to be talking to everybody, but you need to know who your kind of key messenger is. And then, you know, you really have to have statistics and facts to back up what you're saying. And the most poignant conversations that Joel and I have been involved in revolve around a CEO kind of being very clear on the line with a member. Look, I've got 3 weeks, and at that point, I don't know what I'm going to do on payroll, and you guys have to get moving on this. Those types of, you know, very personal, heartfelt monologues really deliver a message that we as a lobbyist, you know, can't necessarily deliver in our role.
We've got a number of questions here in the Q&A. If anyone wants to add some, please pull down and add them to the Q&A. I'll also make sure we get to the ones in the chat as well. But want to dive in. So first question we have is, are letters from sign-ons from multiple organizations effective? Do they offer any value?
Yeah, I think so. I think particularly sort of in the moment in the legislative process where you had the business community all coming out and saying, we really need X, or a group of governors would get together and say, we really need Y. I think those things were powerful. And what's interesting is how challenging those types of letters are getting to be, right? We used to take those things for granted as not all that important. And now getting 10 people to sign on something, the logistics themselves are a challenge. So I think they do help. It's not just the letter. If you send a letter, you know, itself, that's not as powerful as sending the letter and maybe getting it picked up, you know, in the DC media as part of the debate, and really making sure you're getting it out there on social media and all that kind of stuff. Those are the letters that I think have really been impactful. And really, it's not just the letter, it's the traditional and social media follow-up.
Yeah, don't let yourself get wrapped up in the writing of the letter. A lot of times the letter is just a means to the end, getting groups agreeing and on message with the same message. So sometimes I've seen these letters say, well, this sentence has to be written this way, and otherwise we're not signing on. Otherwise the whole effort is worthless. It's come to an agreement quickly on language that everybody can agree on, because it's most important who's on that letterhead. And even more important is who do you send it to and how do you use it to get that conversation that's going to get you what you want. Because the letter it is what it is. It's going to get in someone's inbox. They're going to look at it and they're going to move on. It's what the impact is when they looked at it for the 2 minutes that they did look at it, and when they skimmed it, did they read it and say, okay, these are constituencies that I care about, that my boss cares about, and what did they ask me to do with it? They asked me to take it to the chairman to the speaker. Did they ask me to go straight to the speaker, to McConnell? You need to tell that recipient what you want them to do with that, the content of that letter, to make it worthwhile in this fast-moving environment.
That's really helpful. Next question that's come in is, what are you hearing about process changes in Congress to allow non-COVID related business to continue, specifically markups for things like appropriations or the National Defense Authorization Act?
Yeah, good question. You know, I know that Hill staff and others are struggling with this. I think, you know, there is first and foremost a hope that we'll be able to get back to something that looks like at least more normal, if not, you know, totally normal activities on the Hill, particularly if they, you know, I think reopening the Hill to the public probably doesn't happen as soon as members returning with appropriate, you know, spacing in meetings and such to be able to start working through stuff. But I'd answer the question a slightly different way, which is to say, the defense authorization is going to happen. They will need to move forward. I think you can kind of almost skip the markup stage to a certain extent and just make sure the committee is incorporating as much as possible from member requests into draft bills and circulate those things so that you're not in the situation of having a live markup. But I think a lot of things that we were presuming and that normally happen on a particular schedule during the year, and I'm thinking now about appropriations markups, probably get put off just because of the amount of time the same staff are spending on, CARES and now CARES Act 2 and then COVID-5 after that, assuming we have some kind of stimulus bill. My guess is at some point we're going to do a long-term CR through December at least, and just admit we're going to take this through the election, see what happens. And when staff gets some free time between here and there, they'll do markups and try and get bills through committee and then conference them. But I think my guess is we're going to do some kind of shortened process this year in the appropriation space to address FY21.
That's helpful. A follow-up that came into that is someone who's been engaging in advocacy efforts and saw a supplement in the third package. They're currently working with leadership on the fourth, and their question is, during this COVID-4 focus, is it still effective to be engaging in regular fiscal year 21 appropriations advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to continue to do stuff. So it's a broader question, right? Most staff are spending most of their time working on COVID-related stuff right now. So when you are coming at them with an FY21 approps request or a WRDA authorization issue or, a trade issue for the finance committee or whatever, you have to do that from the context of, I know you are spending 90% of your time on the thing that we all want you to be spending your time on right now, but I thought I'd just take a couple minutes to catch you up on this. And so it's how you do it. I think you have to continue to have those conversations. The government is continuing to run. Not everybody in the executive branch is spending all their time on COVID. Some people are, EPA is pumping out rules. The Corps of Engineers is still, dredging waterways. So, we have to keep doing our normal lives, albeit with a sensitivity to the fact that, a lot of the folks we're dealing with are have a day job now that is coronavirus, most of the time.
On that, a question that came in along those similar lines: should lobbyists try to schedule introduction non-COVID-19 related virtual meetings with Hill staff, or should that wait until after the pandemic somewhat subsides?
That was a setup question.
Right. Yeah, I think along the lines of what Rich was just saying, I think it's important. But I think one caveat I would give is that just understand as staff are working remotely, as there isn't the action item that you're wanting them to take, getting particular language into a markup, talking to committee staff and moving a particular piece of legislation isn't going to happen right now because that legislation's not moving. You should have those conversations. Assume that a lot of them are foundational, that even if you're delivering the ask, that you commit to the staffer at the time and make sure that you follow up to say, as things return to normal, we will circle back with you on this. But that at least allows you to, when things return to normal, you can say, as you recall, we did a video conference during COVID-19 about this topic, but just to refresh your recollection, and then deliver the ask again. But that way it won't be the first time they've heard it from you. I think you're doing a disservice to your company or to your clients if you're not continuing to have some of those foundational conversations so that you can keep moving things forward. Because there will be, once things return to normal, there's going to be a rush of activity as Congress tries to finish the approps process, the NDAA, reauthorization, surface transportation, if that's not in COVID-5. There's going to be a bunch of things that are going to burst the floodgates at that time. And if you haven't laid some groundwork, you're going to be behind the game.
Yeah, I would just say in terms of like introductory meetings, like, hi, I'm new to this job with company X, and I'm covering labor issues for them. This is not probably the time to be doing that. I think those meetings really have to take a back seat. Just understanding that, in the best of times, staff don't have a lot of time for that. And we do a lot of that by grabbing a cup of coffee or whatever. But right now they really don't have the time. And I'm sure people would sit there holding their chair tightly saying, why is this person taking my time for this right now?
Mm-hmm. Joel, you talked a little bit about what's to come. One of the questions that we got is, at what time will the Hill conversation shift from emergency funding to addressing systems and infrastructure problems?
Yes, so some of that's going to become part of the stimulus discussion, which the speaker has signaled now is on to COVID-5. We do have a surface transportation bill that is required to be reauthorized by October 1st. And Congress was already working on those topics. That is likely to become woven into the fabric of COVID response as we get to a point where we can effectively do economic stimulus and help fund projects that will take the millions of Americans that lost their jobs and put them back to work. So that is already happening. If you have an infrastructure interest, you should be laying the groundwork right now, connecting the dots to previous conversations, acknowledging that the first and foremost priority of members of Congress and staff should be the preservation of lives and the U.S. economy, but that you want to identify an infrastructure need that is acute and should be included at the appropriate time. But with that opening, as Rich said, with that acknowledgement, you should be advancing your infrastructure priorities now, because there will be a time when that pops, and it will move very quickly once it does. It may not get enacted in COVID-5, but certainly the speaker has already asked all the committee chairs to submit their priorities, and if you're not getting your members to get to the chair, the appropriate chair, and get those priorities to the speaker so that they're on a list that can be pulled off the shelf and moved quickly once it's moving, then you're already a little bit behind the game.
That's really helpful. Two more questions before we wrap up. The first of those is, do you predict any technology dynamics or breakthrough forms of advocacy as a game changer for approaching lobbying?
I don't think we're going to see things change too much out of this particular circumstance. I don't think, for instance, people are going to stop doing fly-ins and just do Zoom-ins now or something like that. I think a lot of what has happened in the advent of social media becoming an advocacy tool over the last decade or so really is taking things that we've done traditionally through other mechanisms, whether it be letters or phone calls or whatever, and kind of put it through the supercharging of social media. So I don't see any major technological changes here in how lobbying is conducted based on this experience necessarily. I do think the reliance on these types of video events, it's not all that long ago where we were using traditional webinar software, where there wasn't a video component to it. So now with newer technologies like Skype and Zoom, we're in this space where we're able to do these virtual meetings. I think that will become sort of more frequent, but I don't think it's going to supplant, in-office meetings and lobbying fly-ins and those types of things. I think it will just be another adjunct tool.
Joel, we'll ask you the same question to wrap up as our second question was very similar along these lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Rich is right. I think there's going to be ways, in particular, some groups that you could describe as disenfranchised, or those that may not have the resources to come to DC. I think this is proving the concept that getting them in front of their member of Congress or in front of staff is something that is doable and still not the same as in person, but certainly has the capability of delivering your message and making a personal connection. Even if it is through an online video, that has happened. So if you are a business and you need to get your plant manager or your local affiliate, get them on the phone or on the video with your congressional staffer to make a difference. I think this has proven that you can make that happen. I think the other point that Rich alluded to, which is during these times when staff are also out of the office, but even when they're back in the office and everybody's on social media looking for the latest news, I think getting into their narrative, there are some creative strategies on the communication side with making sure your message is omnipresent for those that are considering and making decisions. I think that is another tool that will continue to grow and has been emphasized here as we're all looking for news wherever we can get it about the crisis.
Well, a big thank you to both Rich and Joel for joining us today. If you want to receive a recording of this feedback, please make sure that you fill out the survey that'll pop up here at the end. We would love your feedback on the webinar. And as always, you can reach Rich and Joel. Both their contact information is available if you Google their names in Holland and Knight. And to learn more about Quorum, we're at www.quorum.us. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Wash your hands.